Mara Whitlow stood frozen in the doorway of her father's house, her sister's wedding dress pooling at her feet like spilled milk. Outside, the stagecoach bound for Wyoming idled in the dust, its driver checking his pocket watch with growing impatience. Inside, her father's hand gripped her shoulder hard enough to bruise. "You'll go," he said, his voice flat as Kansas prairie. "You'll go, and you'll keep your mouth shut about it." Mara looked at the money on the table, Caleb Rowan's payment for a bride he'd never met, and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that she'd just been sold to save her sister's reputation. Before we begin Mara's journey from unwanted daughter to chosen woman, I invite you to follow this story to the very end. If it moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of truth and second chances travels across this wide country of ours. The Nebraska wind had a way of finding every crack in a person's armor, and Mara Whitlow had more cracks than most. She stood at the kitchen window of her father's farmhouse, her hands submerged in dishwater gone cold, watching her younger sister Lillian hold court in the yard like some visiting dignitary. 3 neighbor boys had found excuses to stop by, their Sunday shirts still smelling of lye soap, their hands clutching wildflowers they'd probably stolen from their own mother's gardens. Lillian laughed, that bright, crystalline sound that made men stupid and women jealous, and touched young Thomas Brennan's arm with practiced ease. The boy's face went red as summer strawberries. "Mara." Her mother's voice cut through the kitchen like a dull blade. "Those dishes won't wash themselves." "No, ma'am." Mara plunged her hands back into the gray water, scrubbing at a pot with enough force to take the finish off. 23 years old, and this was her dominion. The kitchen, the henhouse, the vegetable garden that fed a family who rarely thanked her for the feeding. She was useful the way a good plow horse was useful. Sturdy, reliable, unremarkable. The door banged open, and Lillian swept in like weather, all golden curls and flushed cheeks. At 19, she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, never been passed over, never been anything but treasured. "Did you see?" Lillian spun in a circle, her skirts flaring. "Thomas brought me wildflowers, and Jacob Miller asked if he could call on Sunday." "I saw." Mara kept her eyes on the dishes. "You could try smiling once in a while, Mara. It wouldn't kill you." Lillian plucked an apple from the bowl on the table and bit into it with white, perfect teeth. "Men like a woman who looks pleasant." Their mother made a small noise of agreement as she kneaded bread dough with fierce, practiced movements. Elizabeth Whitlow had been a beauty once. You could see it in the bones of her face, the ghost of what time and hardship had worn away. She'd passed that beauty to Lillian like an inheritance and given Mara everything else. The strong back, the plain features, the practical nature that made her good for work, but poor for courting. "Men like a lot of things," Mara said quietly. "Pleasant is just one of them." "Well, you'd know all about what men don't like, wouldn't you?" Lillian's voice carried no malice, which somehow made it worse. It was simply fact, delivered with the careless cruelty of someone who'd never had to measure her words. "I don't mean to be unkind, Mara. It's just, you're not getting any younger. And Father says, That's enough, Lillian." Their mother's voice carried a warning, but the damage was done, settling into Mara's chest with familiar weight. She was 23, unmarried, and unlikely to change either condition. In a place like Weeping Bluff, Nebraska, that made her a cautionary tale in the making, the eldest daughter who'd missed her chance, grown too old, too set in her ways, too comfortable with spinsterhood to be saved from it. She finished the dishes in silence while Lillian chattered about the church social next month, about the new ribbon she wanted for her hair, about nothing and everything with equal enthusiasm. When the work was done, Mara dried her hands on her apron and slipped out the back door, seeking the only peace she ever found. In the barn, among creatures who didn't care about pretty faces or marriage prospects. The milk cow, Bessie, huffed a greeting as Mara entered the dim, hay-sweet space. Mara pressed her forehead against the cow's warm flank and let herself breathe. "At least you don't judge," she murmured. "Talking to livestock now?" Her father's voice made her jump. James Whitlow stood in the barn doorway, a dark shape against the afternoon light. He was a hard man, made harder by years of drought and debt, of watching neighbors prosper while his own fields produced just enough to keep starvation at arm's length. Got something to show you. He held out an envelope, creased and travel-worn. Mara took it with careful fingers, her heart beginning a slow, uneasy thump. Letter came for Lillian, her father said, from Wyoming Territory. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was careful, almost painstaking, the script of a man unused to writing letters but determined to do it properly. Miss Lillian Whitlow, I am writing in response to your letter of inquiry regarding matrimonial prospects in Wyoming Territory. I am a rancher with 200 acres outside Cheyenne, raising cattle and horses. I am 32 years of age, in good health, and of sound financial standing. I have need of a wife to help manage the household and provide companionship. If you are still amenable to this arrangement, I will send passage money for your journey west. You may expect to arrive by late September. Respectfully, Caleb Rowan Mara read it twice, the words blurring on the second pass. Lillian's been writing to a mail-order advertisement. 3 months now. Her father's jaw worked. Sent her tintype and everything. Fool thing to do, but your mother thought... He broke off, shaking his head. Money came yesterday. $80 for passage and wedding expenses. $80. Mara's mind reeled. That was more than her father made in 6 months of breaking his back over stubborn Nebraska soil. She's going then. It wasn't a question. Of course Lillian was going. A Wyoming rancher with 200 acres and $80 to spare on a bride he'd never met. That was the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. She won't go. The words hung in the barn like smoke. Mara looked up sharply. What? Lillian won't go. Her father's face was carved from stone, revealing nothing. Started crying this morning when the money came. Said she'd made a mistake, that she couldn't possibly leave Nebraska, couldn't leave her mother, couldn't... He made a disgusted sound. Hysterical nonsense. Then send the money back. Mara tried to hand him the letter, but he didn't take it. Can't do that. Why not? Because we already spent half of it. Her father's voice went flat. Seed debt from spring. Payment was due last week. We pay it, or we lose the farm. Mara's stomach dropped. Father, a deal's been struck. Money's been sent. Man's expecting a bride. James Whitlow met his daughter's eyes with something that might have been shame on another man, but on him looked more like grim determination. You'll go in her place. The barn spun. Mara gripped the stall door to steady herself. No, that's fraud. That's survival. Her father's voice cut like winter wind. That rancher sent money for a Whitlow daughter. He'll get a Whitlow daughter. Your mother's already altering Lillian's good dress to fit you. Stagecoach leaves Saturday morning. He's expecting Lillian. Mara's voice came out thin, desperate. He's got her tintype. He'll know I'm not... You'll tell him there was a mistake, that Lillian took ill or changed her mind or whatever story sits easiest. You'll tell him you're her older sister and you're willing to honor the arrangement. Her father stepped closer, and Mara could smell the tobacco and desperation on him. You're a good girl, Mara. Practical. Steady. You'll make a fine rancher's wife. Probably better than Lillian ever would. And you'll have a home of your own instead of growing old in our kitchen. This is wrong. But even as she said it, Mara felt the trap closing around her. The farm that fed them. The debt that would take it away. Her mother's face, already worn thin with worry. Lillian's golden future, unmarred by scandal or whispers. And herself. Plain Mara, useful Mara, 23 and fading like old calico. What was she worth measured against all of that? Saturday morning, her father repeated. Be ready. He left her there in the barn, holding another woman's love letter, already half gone to a place she'd never seen. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like a funeral than a wedding. Mara's mother altered Lillian's second-best dress, the good one Lillian insisted on keeping, with quick, efficient stitches that said more than words about her feelings on the matter. The fabric was a serviceable gray wool, practical for travel, and it hung on Mara's frame with none of the grace it had shown on her sister. You'll need to let out the hem, her mother said around a mouthful of pins. You're taller than Lillian. I'm aware. Mara stood still as a fence post while her mother worked, feeling like a doll being dressed for someone else's game. Lillian hovered nearby, her face a study in relief and guilt. "You'll write, won't you? Tell me everything about Wyoming." "Will I?" Mara's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "I thought you wanted to forget this whole business." "That's unkind." Lillian's eyes welled with tears, real ones probably, though Mara had stopped being able to tell the difference years ago. "I didn't ask you to do this." "No." Mara met her sister's gaze in the mirror. "You just made it necessary." The tears spilled over, and their mother made a tutting sound. "Mara, that's enough. Your sister is sensitive." Sensitive. The word had been Lillian's shield her whole life. Too sensitive for hard work, too sensitive for criticism, too sensitive for the consequences of her own choices. Mara swallowed the bitter laugh that wanted to escape and went back to being still. On Friday evening, her father brought home a small trunk. Nothing fancy, just pine boards and iron hinges, but new enough that the wood still smelled of sap. "For your things," he said gruffly, setting it at the foot of Mara's narrow bed. Mara stared at it. "I don't have enough things to fill it." "Then you'll fill it when you get there." He paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the lamplight. "This is a good thing, Mara, a fresh start. A man with land and prospects. You could do worse." "I could do honestly," she said quietly. "Honesty's a luxury." Her father's voice went hard. "Poor folks can't afford it." He left before she could respond, not that she would have. What was there to say? He was right, in his way. Honesty was expensive, and the Whitlow family was broke in more ways than one. Mara packed by candlelight, 2 work dresses, 1 Sunday dress that had been her grandmother's, undergarments, stockings, a wool shawl, a hairbrush with a cracked handle, a book of poetry that had belonged to her mother before marriage and motherhood had worn away her interest in such things. At the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, she placed the only photograph of herself that existed, taken 3 years ago at the county fair, her face serious, her eyes looking just past the camera like she was searching for an escape route even then. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out Caleb Rowan's letter, reading it again by the flickering light. "I have need of a wife to help manage the household and provide companionship. Not love, not romance. Companionship." The word was honest, at least. Transactional. He needed help, and he was willing to pay for it. At least he hadn't dressed it up in flowery language or false promises. "You may expect to arrive by late September. 3 days from now, she'd step off a stagecoach in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory and into the life of a man who'd paid good money for a woman who didn't exist." The deception sat in her stomach like spoiled meat. A soft knock on the door made her look up. Lillian slipped into the room, closing the door behind her with exaggerated care. In the candlelight, she looked almost ethereal, golden hair loose around her shoulders, white nightgown making her look like something from a storybook. "I couldn't sleep," Lillian said. She sat on the bed beside Mara, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Are you frightened?" "Should I be?" "I don't know." Lillian picked at the embroidery on her nightgown. "When I first wrote to him, I thought it would be an adventure. A handsome rancher in the wild territories, needing a woman brave enough to join him. It sounded like something from a novel. And when reality arrived with $80 attached, it stopped being romantic." "Don't be cruel, Mara." But there was no heat in Lillian's words. "You're braver than I am. You always have been." Mara almost laughed. "I'm not brave. I'm just out of options." "That's not true." Lillian turned to face her, and in the uncertain light, Mara could almost believe her sister's concern was genuine. "You could refuse. Tell father no." "And then what? Watch the farm get taken? Watch mother work herself into an early grave?" Mara shook her head. "Someone has to go. Might as well be the daughter no one will miss." "I'll miss you." Lillian's voice broke on the words. "I know you don't believe me, but I will." Mara wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that her sister's tears were more than performance, that somewhere beneath the vanity and self-absorption was real affection. But wanting and having were different countries, and Mara had learned long ago not to confuse the two. "Go to bed, Lillian." She pulled her hand free gently. "You'll need your rest. You've got a long life ahead of you." After Lillian left, Mara blew out the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, her father's heavy tread in the room below, her mother's soft coughing, the wind rattling the loose board on the north wall that never got fixed, no matter how many times she mentioned it. Tomorrow, these sounds would belong to someone else's life. Saturday morning came with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that promised rain. Mara stood in the kitchen in Lillian's altered dress, the wool itching against her skin, while her mother fussed with a bonnet that wouldn't sit right. "There." Elizabeth stepped back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You look fine, Mara. Just fine." Fine. Not beautiful, not lovely, just fine. The word fit like the dress did. Adequate, but not quite right. Her father loaded her trunk onto the waiting stagecoach while Mara stood in the yard, memorizing details she'd never paid attention to before. The way the chicken coop leaned slightly east, the 3 missing pickets in the fence, the rose bush her mother had planted the year Mara was born, still blooming despite years of neglect. "Ready?" Her father's voice was gruff. Mara turned to look at her family, gathered to see her off like she was going to war. Her mother, twisting her apron in work-roughened hands. Lillian, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Her father, solid and immovable as a tree stump. "No," Mara said honestly. "But I'll go anyway." Her mother pulled her into a fierce embrace, smelling of lye and lavender and all the small comforts of home. "Be good," she whispered. "Write when you can. And Mara." She pulled back, holding her daughter at arm's length. "You're worth more than you know. Don't let anyone tell you different." The words hit Mara square in the chest. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Lillian's hug was briefer, more careful, conscious, perhaps, of wrinkling her dress. "I'll never forget this," she said. "Never." "That's what I'm afraid of," Mara thought, but she kept it to herself. Her father handed her into the coach, his grip firm on her elbow. "You're a good daughter, Mara. Better than I deserve." It was the closest thing to tenderness she'd heard from him in years, and it nearly broke her. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man with tobacco-stained teeth, tipped his hat. "We're burning daylight, miss. You ready?" Mara climbed into the coach, settling onto the hard bench seat. Through the window, she watched her family grow smaller as the horses started forward. Her mother waving, Lillian crying prettily, her father standing with his arms crossed, already turning back toward the fields. The stagecoach lurched over a rut, and Weeping Bluff, Nebraska, the only home Mara had ever known, disappeared behind a rise in the land. She sat alone in the compartment, hands folded in her lap, and let herself shake. She was going west with a lie in her pocket and fear in her throat, toward a man who'd paid for someone else, toward a future built on deception. But beneath the fear, beneath the guilt, there was something else stirring, something that felt dangerously like hope. Maybe in Wyoming, she could be more than useful. Maybe in Wyoming, she could be enough. The stagecoach rolled on, carrying Mara toward whatever waited at the end of the road, truth or consequence, redemption or ruin. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and for the first time in her life, Mara Whitlow had no idea what came next. That terrified her. But it also made her feel alive. The journey west was a lesson in discomfort and endurance. The stagecoach rattled over rough roads, through small towns that all looked the same, weathered buildings, dusty streets, suspicious eyes watching strangers pass. Mara shared the cramped space with a rotating cast of travelers, a whiskey drummer with breath that could strip paint, a minister's wife who spent 3 hours lecturing on the sins of vanity, a young couple so wrapped up in each other they didn't notice when Mara had to wedge herself against the door to give them more room. At night, they stopped at stations, ramshackle buildings that offered beds with questionable linens and meals that sat heavy in the stomach. Mara barely slept, lying awake in rooms shared with snoring strangers, her mind churning with what waited at the end of the road. She tried to imagine Caleb Rowan. His letter had been spare, revealing little. 32 years old, 9 years her senior. A rancher with land, which meant he was either lucky, ruthless, or both. The words had been formal, almost stiff, but the handwriting had been careful, suggesting a man who took pains with details. What would he do when she stepped off the coach and he saw her face? Plain, honest, nothing like the golden beauty he'd been promised. The question haunted her mile after grinding mile. On the fourth day, the landscape began to change. The flat monotony of Nebraska prairie gave way to rolling hills, then to something wilder, land that looked like it had never been fully tamed, all sage and scrub and distances that hurt to look at. The air smelled different here, sharp and clean, carrying hints of pine from mountains she couldn't yet see. "Cheyenne, 2 hours," the driver called down. Mara's stomach clenched. 2 hours. 120 minutes between her old life and whatever came next. She pulled out a small mirror and studied her reflection with brutal honesty. Brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, already coming loose from days of travel. Eyes the color of creek mud, serviceable, unremarkable. A face that was pleasant enough if you weren't looking for beauty, with a chin that suggested stubbornness and a mouth that forgot how to smile somewhere around age 12. This was what Caleb Rowan had bought with his $80. Not the golden promise, but the plain truth. Mara tucked the mirror away and straightened her dress, though it was creased beyond help. Her mother had packed a small bottle of rose water meant to be dabbed on before the wedding. Mara pulled it from her bag and wet her wrists, her throat, behind her ears. The scent was delicate, hopeful, everything she wasn't. The stagecoach crested a rise, and there it was, Cheyenne, sprawling in the valley below like something thrown down by hasty hands. It was bigger than she'd expected, more real, an actual town with actual streets, not just the frontier outpost of her imagination. Buildings clustered around a main thoroughfare, and in the distance she could see the dark line of railroad tracks cutting through the landscape like a scar. As they descended into town, Mara's hands began to shake. She gripped them together in her lap, but it didn't help. Her whole body was trembling now, fear and exhaustion and the weight of what she was about to do crashing down all at once. The coach slowed, wheels grinding against packed earth. Mara could see people now, cowboys with dusty hats, women in calico, children chasing each other between buildings. Normal life, continuing like it always did, indifferent to the small personal catastrophe unfolding in her chest. "Cheyenne Station," the driver announced. "End of the line." The coach rocked to a stop, and Mara sat frozen, unable to make herself move. Through the window, she could see the station platform, and standing near the edge, a man. He was tall, taller than her father, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and harder living, dark hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a stance that suggested he was comfortable standing alone, waiting without fidgeting. Even at this distance, there was something contained about him, something that made Mara think of a door locked tight against intruders. The driver opened the coach door. "Here we are, miss. Need help with your trunk?" "Yes," Mara whispered. "Thank you." Her legs felt like water as she climbed down from the coach. The platform was solid beneath her feet, but the world seemed to tilt anyway. The driver hauled her trunk down, setting it beside her with a solid thump. "Good luck to you, miss," he said, tipping his hat. Luck. Yes. She was going to need it. The man was walking toward her now, weaving between other travelers with the easy grace of someone who knew how to move. As he got closer, Mara could see more details. A face that might have been handsome if it wasn't so hard, weather-worn and serious. Eyes the color of winter sky, gray, cool, assessing. A scar cutting through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanently severe expression. He stopped 3 feet away, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Up close, Caleb Rowan was even more intimidating than from a distance. Not because he was threatening, there was nothing aggressive in his stance, but because he was so utterly self-contained. He looked at Mara with the same expression he might use to assess a horse at auction. Careful, measuring, revealing nothing. "Miss Whitlow." His voice matched the rest of him. Deep, economical, without warmth or welcome. Mara's throat had gone bone dry. "Mr. Rowan." His eyes narrowed slightly. Something shifted in his expression, not quite suspicion, but close to it. "You're not what I expected." Here it was. The moment of truth, arriving with all the subtlety of a slap. Mara's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them in front of her to hide it. The platform seemed to sway beneath her feet, and the noise of the station, people calling goodbyes, horses stamping, the hiss of the locomotive, faded to a dull roar in her ears. She could lie. She could smile and deflect and hope that somehow it would all work out. She could be what she'd always been, quiet, compliant, bending herself into whatever shape was required. But standing here in Wyoming territory with nothing left to lose, Mara Whitlow found something she hadn't known she possessed, a thin, stubborn thread of pride. "No," she said, meeting his gray eyes directly. "I'm not." The truth sat between them like a third person, waiting to be acknowledged. Caleb Rowan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those winter eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of anger. "You want to explain that?" "Yes." Mara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "But not here. Not on a train platform with half the town watching. It was a gamble, assuming he'd care about privacy, about discretion. But she'd read his letter enough times to memorize the careful handwriting, the formal tone. This was a man who valued control, order. He wouldn't want a scene any more than she did. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and Mara had the unsettling feeling she was being read like a book he wasn't sure he wanted to finish. Then, without a word, Caleb reached down and lifted her trunk like it weighed nothing, turning toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. "Come on, then." Mara followed on legs that felt disconnected from her body, aware of curious eyes tracking their progress. She climbed into the wagon seat with as much dignity as she could manage, settling her skirts around her while Caleb secured her trunk in the back. When he climbed up beside her, the wagon dipped under his weight. He took up the reins without looking at her, and with a click of his tongue, set the horses moving. They drove through Cheyenne in thick silence, Mara cataloging details with the desperate focus of someone trying to memorize an escape route. A mercantile with whitewashed walls, a saloon with piano music spilling through its doors, a church with a steeple that reached for a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The town gave way to open country, and still Caleb said nothing. He drove with the easy competence of someone who'd made this journey 1,000 times, his hands steady on the reins, his profile carved from granite. Finally, when the town had shrunk to a smudge on the horizon behind them, he spoke. "Who are you?" "Mara Whitlow." She forced herself to keep her voice level. "Lillian's older sister." The muscle in his jaw flexed. "Where's Lillian?" "Home. In Nebraska." Mara's hands twisted in her lap. "She couldn't come." "Couldn't." He said it flat, without inflection. "Or wouldn't." "Both." Honesty tasted like metal in her mouth. "When your money arrived, she realized she'd made a mistake, that she couldn't leave home. So your family decided to send you instead." Still that flat, dangerous calm. "Keep the money, send a different daughter, hope I wouldn't notice the substitution." Put that way, it sounded even worse than it was. "Yes." "And you agreed to this?" Mara turned to look at him, really look at him. That hard profile, those winter eyes fixed on the road ahead. A man who'd paid good money for companionship and gotten fraud instead. He had every right to be furious, and his control only made it more frightening, like watching storm clouds gather without knowing when the lightning would strike. "I agreed," she said quietly, "because my father's farm was about to be taken for debt, and your money was the only thing standing between my family and ruin. I agreed because I'm 23 years old and unmarried, with no prospects and no future worth mentioning. I agreed because in my family, I'm the useful one, the one you send when there's hard work to be done or unpleasant business to handle." She swallowed hard. "But that doesn't make it right. It doesn't change the fact that you were deceived, and I was part of that deception." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, but he still didn't look at her. "You could have told me the truth before I sent the money." "You're right. I should have." Mara stared at her hands. "But I didn't know about any of this until 3 days ago. By then the money was spent and my father had made his decision." "And what's your decision?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" Now he did look at her, and the force of that gray stare made her breath catch. "You came all this way, got on a stagecoach, traveled halfway across the country, knowing you were walking into a lie. That takes a particular kind of courage, or a particular kind of desperation." He turned back to the road. "So I'm asking, what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and Mara realized with a jolt that no one had ever asked her that before. What do you want? Not what was expected of her, not what would be useful, not what would solve someone else's problem, but what she wanted. I want, she said slowly, testing the words, to not be sent back in disgrace. I want to not have made this journey for nothing. She paused, gathering courage. And I want a chance to prove that even though I'm not what you paid for, I might be what you need. Caleb's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders. That's a tall order for a woman I met 10 minutes ago. I know. Mara turned to face forward, watching the landscape roll past. They were climbing now, the road winding through hills dotted with sage and juniper. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky. But I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, manage a household. I'm not afraid of animals or weather or isolation, and I'm honest, more honest than I've been in the last 3 days, anyway. Honest enough to tell a man he's been cheated before he takes you home. Yes? That's something, I suppose. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The only sounds, the creak of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves on packed earth. Here's what's going to happen. I'll take you to the ranch. You'll stay tonight, in the spare room, he added, his voice taking on an edge that suggested he wanted no misunderstanding. Tomorrow morning, in daylight, with a clear head, I'll decide what to do. If I decide to put you on the next stage back to Nebraska, you'll go without argument. Fair? It wasn't fair at all. Her whole future decided overnight by a stranger, but Mara had no leverage for negotiation. Fair. Good. He clicked to the horses, urging them faster. We've got 2 hours of daylight left. Best use them. They drove in silence after that, but it was a different quality of silence. Less hostile, more watchful. Mara studied the country they passed through with hungry eyes, trying to imagine making a life here. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. Nothing like the soft green farmland of Nebraska. This was land that demanded respect, that would break you if you weren't careful, that offered no second chances to the careless or weak. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when Caleb turned the wagon off the main road onto a track that wound through a narrow valley. Cottonwoods lined a creek that ran silver in the fading light, and beyond them, Mara could see buildings taking shape against the darkening sky. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. It looked like it had grown out of the land rather than being imposed upon it, weathered but well-maintained. A barn stood nearby. Red paint faded to the color of dried blood, and beyond that were corrals, outbuildings, the infrastructure of a working ranch. 200 acres, Caleb said, following her gaze. Cattle mostly, some horses. Creek runs year-round, which makes it worth more than acreage twice the size without water. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. It's not fancy, but it's sound. It's beautiful, Mara said, and meant it. Caleb glanced at her sharply, as if suspecting mockery, but whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. He climbed down and came around to help her from the wagon, his hands firm on her waist as he lifted her to the ground. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, awareness of his strength, his solidity, the heat of him even through layers of fabric. He released her quickly, stepping back like she'd burned him, and turned to unhitch the horses. Go on inside, he said without looking at her. I'll bring your trunk in after I've seen to the team. Mara climbed the porch steps on shaking legs and pushed open the front door. It wasn't locked. Probably nothing was locked out here, miles from town with no neighbors in sight. The interior was dim, lit only by the last of the daylight filtering through curtainless windows, but she could make out the shapes of furniture, the outline of a staircase leading to the second floor. She stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter uninvited, until Caleb's voice came from behind her. You going to stand there all night, or are you going to light a lamp? Mara stepped inside, feeling along the wall until her fingers found a shelf, and on it, the smooth glass of a lamp base. Matches sat beside it in a tin box. Her hands remembered the familiar motions, striking the match, lifting the glass chimney, touching flame to wick. Light bloomed, pushing back the shadows, and the room came into focus. It was a working man's house, spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by 2 chairs that had seen better days. A table with 4 mismatched chairs stood near the kitchen area, and she could see a cook stove, shelves lined with dishes, a dry sink. Everything was orderly, almost aggressively neat, as if the owner had imposed rigid control on his surroundings to make up for some internal chaos. Caleb came in carrying her trunk like it weighed nothing, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He set it down near the stairs and straightened, looking around the room as if seeing it through her eyes. "I know it's not much," he said gruffly. "A woman's touch would help, I suppose. That's part of why I—" He broke off, shaking his head. "Kitchen's through there. Pantry's stocked. Spare room is upstairs, first door on the right. My room's at the end of the hall." "It's a good house," Mara said. "Solid. It keeps the weather out." Caleb moved to the fireplace, crouching to lay a fire with practiced efficiency. "You hungry?" Mara's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly in the quiet room. She pressed a hand to it, embarrassed, but Caleb's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "I'll take that as a yes." He stood, brushing bark from his hands. "I'm no cook, but I can manage beans and bacon without poisoning us both. Unless you'd rather." "I'll cook." Mara moved toward the kitchen, grateful for something to do with her hands. "If you'll show me where things are." He hesitated, clearly not used to having someone in his space, then nodded. "Coffee's in the tin on the top shelf. Bacon's in the cold cellar, along with eggs and milk. Got potatoes in the bin, onions hanging in the pantry." He watched as she lit the cook stove, adding wood from the box beside it. "You really know what you're doing." "I've been cooking for my family since I was 8 years old." Mara tested the stove's heat with her palm, nodding in satisfaction. "This is nicer than what we had in Nebraska. Heats more evenly." "Bought it from a catalog." Caleb leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "Salesman said it was the finest model available. Cost me near as much as 2 breeding heifers." "It's a good stove." Mara found a skillet, set it on the heat, went to fetch the bacon from the cellar. When she returned, Caleb was still standing there, watching her move around his kitchen with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Something wrong?" she asked. "No." He straightened abruptly. "I'll go check the stock, give you some room to work." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing behind him with a solid thunk. Mara stood alone in the kitchen, bacon sizzling in the pan, and let herself breathe. She'd done it. She'd told him the truth, and he hadn't immediately thrown her back on the stagecoach. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was a chance. A single night to prove her worth. Mara set to work with the focus of someone who knew her future depended on a decent meal. She found flour and leavening, mixed up biscuits and set them to bake. Fried potatoes and onions to go with the bacon, scrambled eggs with fresh cream from the cellar. When Caleb returned half an hour later, stamping dust from his boots on the porch, the kitchen smelled like home. He stopped in the doorway, and something crossed his face too fast for her to name. "Smells good." "It's ready." Mara set plates on the table, trying not to feel like she was playing house in someone else's life. "I hope you're hungry." They sat across from each other at the scarred wooden table, the meal spread between them like a peace offering. Caleb ate with the single-minded focus of a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. But after the 3rd biscuit, he paused. "These are good." He said it like an accusation. "Thank you. Better than anything I've had in—" He broke off, shaking his head. "You learned this from your mother?" "My grandmother mostly. She believed a woman who couldn't cook was a woman who couldn't survive." Mara broke open a biscuit, watching steam rise. "She died when I was 12. I've been cooking for the family ever since." "Your mother didn't cook?" "My mother had her hands full with other things. The garden, the chickens, keeping my father's temper managed." Mara heard the bitterness creep into her voice and tried to soften it. "And keeping Lillian happy, of course. That was a full-time occupation." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You don't like your sister much." "I love my sister." The words came automatically, worn smooth by years of repetition. But liking her is different. Lillian's beautiful, charming, everything a daughter should be. I'm the other one, the useful one, the one you don't show off but you can't do without. Useful's not nothing. Caleb reached for another biscuit. Beautiful fades. Useful lasts. It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years, and it hit Mara with unexpected force. She looked down at her plate, blinking hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. "You all right?" Caleb's voice had gone gruff with discomfort. "Fine." Mara forced herself to meet his gaze. "Just tired. It's been a long few days." "I expect it has." He pushed back from the table, carrying his plate to the dry sink. "You did good work here. Thank you." The simple courtesy nearly undid her. "You're welcome." Caleb stood at the window, looking out at the darkening valley. "I came west after the war," he said abruptly. "Spent 4 years in Union Blue, watching boys die over things that seemed to matter at the time, but look pretty small from this distance. When it was over, I couldn't go back to Pennsylvania. Too many ghosts, too many people who wanted to talk about battles and glory." His hand came up to touch the scar through his eyebrow, an unconscious gesture. "So I came here, bought this land with my mustering out pay, and built something that was mine. Took me 8 years to make it profitable, another 3 to make it comfortable." Mara stayed silent, sensing he needed to say this. "I'm not a man who needs much," Caleb continued. "I'm comfortable alone. But this place," he gestured at the room around them, "it's too quiet sometimes, too empty. I thought a wife might fix that, might make it feel less like I'm just waiting for something that's never going to come. And instead you got me." Mara tried to keep her voice light. "A stranger who came under false pretenses." You came honest in the end." Caleb turned to face her. "That counts for something." "Does it count for enough?" The question sat between them, heavy with implication. Caleb's jaw worked, and for a moment Mara thought he might answer. Instead, he moved toward the stairs. "I'll bring your trunk up to the spare room. You should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be, He paused, searching for the right word. "Complicated." Mara followed him upstairs, watching as he set her trunk at the foot of a narrow bed in a room that was clean, but clearly unused. A window looked out over the valley, and in the last of the twilight, she could see the creek winding silver through the cottonwoods. "Wash basin's on the stand," Caleb said. "Extra blankets in the chest if you get cold. Nights can be brutal out here, even in September." "Thank you." Mara stood in the doorway, suddenly aware of how close they were in the narrow hallway. Close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the lines that spoke of sun and wind and hard years. Close enough to smell leather and wood smoke and something else. Something that was just him. Caleb cleared his throat and stepped back. "Good night, then." "Good night." She watched him retreat down the hall to his own room, the door closing with a soft click. Only then did Mara enter the spare room and shut herself in, leaning against the door with her heart pounding like she'd run a mile. She'd done it. Survived the first night. But tomorrow he would decide, and she had no idea which way the scales would tip. Mara unpacked her small trunk with methodical care, hanging her 2 work dresses on pegs, setting her brush and mirror on the washstand, tucking her grandmother's Sunday dress into the chest at the foot of the bed. When everything was in its place, she stood at the window and looked out at the Wyoming darkness. The sky here was different than in Nebraska, bigger somehow, crowded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The creek sang its endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. It was wild and strange, and nothing like home. But as Mara stood there in her borrowed room in a stranger's house, she felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Not quite hope, but its sister. Possibility. She'd spent 23 years being the daughter no one noticed, the sister no one valued, the woman no one wanted. Maybe here, in this hard country with this hard man, she could be something different, if he gave her the chance. Mara washed her face in cold water from the basin, changed into her nightgown, and climbed into the narrow bed. The mattress was firm, the blankets rough but clean, and through the walls she could hear the faint sounds of Caleb moving around his room. Boots hitting the floor, the creak of bed springs, the settling of a man preparing for sleep. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about tomorrow. Sleep came in fits and starts, full of dreams that tangled past and present. Her father's disappointed face, Lillian's golden hair, Caleb's winter eyes studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. When she finally woke to pale dawn light filtering through the curtainless window, Mara felt like she'd been dragged behind a wagon. She dressed quickly in one of her work dresses, pinned her hair into a severe bun, and crept downstairs. The house was silent, but when she reached the kitchen, she found evidence that Caleb had already been up. A coffee cup in the dry sink, still warm to the touch. Through the window, she could see him in the barn, moving among the animals with easy competence. Mara set to work. She built up the fire in the cook stove, set coffee to boil, found eggs and cream, and the last of yesterday's bacon. By the time Caleb came in from the barn, breakfast was on the table and the kitchen smelled like civilization. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene with those unreadable gray eyes. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." Mara poured coffee into 2 cups. "Besides, you're feeding me. Least I can do is cook." Caleb sat, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup like it was something precious. He drank it black and hot, closing his eyes briefly as the caffeine hit his system. They ate in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, or at least less uncomfortable than last night. Mara found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way he cut his food with military precision, the way his hands moved with complete confidence, the way a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead when he bent over his plate. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, Caleb stood and moved to the window. Dawn was breaking properly now, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose. He stood with his back to her, shoulders tense, and Mara knew the moment of judgment had arrived. "I've been thinking," he said finally. Mara's heart climbed into her throat. "Yes?" "About what you said yesterday, about proving you're what I need, even if you're not what I paid for." He turned to face her, and the morning light made his scars stand out in sharp relief. "I'm not sure what I need, to be honest. Company, I suppose. Someone to talk to besides horses and cows. Someone to make this place feel less like a way station and more like a home." "I can do that," Mara said quietly. "If you'll let me." "Can you?" Caleb's gaze was direct, searching. "You've been here less than a day. You don't know me, don't know this life, don't know if you can stand the isolation, the work, the winters that'll freeze your breath in your lungs. You might last a week before you're begging me to put you on that stagecoach back to Nebraska." "I might," Mara admitted, "or I might surprise you." Something almost like a smile touched Caleb's mouth. "You've already done that." He was quiet for a long moment, and Mara held her breath, waiting. "Here's what I'm thinking. You stay. We give this a trial, say 3 months. You help run the house, I'll pay you a fair wage for the work. At the end of 3 months, we'll both know better what we're dealing with. If you want to go, I'll pay your passage back to Nebraska, no questions asked. If you want to stay—" He paused. "We'll figure out what that looks like." It wasn't what she'd expected. Not a proposal, not even really an acceptance, but it was a chance. More than a chance. It was respect, offered from a man who didn't seem to give it lightly. 3 months, Mara repeated. "And you'll pay me?" "Same as I'd pay any hired help. Fair's fair." Caleb extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Mara looked at his outstretched hand, scarred, work roughened, steady as stone. She thought about Nebraska, about her father's farm and her mother's worn face and Lillian's golden future. She thought about the lie that had brought her here and the truth that might let her stay. She took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, real. "We have a deal." The handshake lasted a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when Caleb released her hand, Mara could still feel the ghost of his touch on her palm. "Good." Caleb moved toward the door with the air of a man who'd settled something important and now needed to get back to work. "I've got fence to mend in the north pasture. Should be back by noon. Make yourself at home. Look around. Figure out where things are. If you're going to be here, you'll need to know the layout." "What about—" Mara hesitated. "What do I tell people? If anyone comes by, asks who I am?" Caleb paused with his hand on the door. "Tell them the truth. You're Mara Whitlow, staying on to help manage the house. Anyone asks beyond that, tell them it's none of their damn business." He settled his hat on his head. "We've got one neighbor close enough to matter. Luke Carter runs cattle on the property west of here. Good man, but he talks more than I'd like. You meet him, be polite, but don't give him your life story." "I'll remember that." After Caleb left, Mara stood in the middle of the kitchen and let herself really look at the space that might become her domain. It was clean but cheerless, functional but empty of any warmth. A bachelor's kitchen kept orderly because disorder would mean facing the loneliness it contained. She could fix that. Mara spent the morning exploring the house with the careful attention of someone mapping territory. The parlor held those two worn chairs, a small bookshelf with mostly agricultural texts and a few volumes that surprised her. Poetry by Whitman, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, a book of philosophy so heavily annotated the margins were black with ink. Caleb Rowan, it seemed, was not the simple frontiersman he appeared. Upstairs, she found two more bedrooms besides her own and Caleb's. Both empty, both dusty with disuse. The windows needed washing, the floors needed scrubbing, and the whole house needed the kind of deep cleaning that came from having someone who cared about more than just basic function. By noon, Mara had made a mental list of projects that would keep her busy for weeks. The pantry needed organizing, the windows needed curtains, the garden plot behind the house needed tending before winter set in. There was work here, real work, the kind that mattered, and the prospect of it made something in her chest unfold like a flower reaching for sun. She was elbow-deep in scrubbing the parlor windows when hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Mara dried her hands on her apron and went to the door, expecting Caleb back early. Instead, she found a stranger, a man perhaps 5 years older than Caleb, with sandy hair and an easy smile that showed too many teeth. He sat astride a chestnut gelding, his posture relaxed, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with an openness that made her want to step back inside and close the door. "Well, hello there." The stranger's voice was warm, friendly, colored with genuine surprise. "I was expecting Caleb, but this is a much prettier sight." Mara felt her spine straighten. "Mr. Rowan is mending fence. He should be back soon." "No hurry." The man swung down from his horse with practiced grace and walked toward the porch, hand extended. "Luke Carter. I run the spread west of here, and you must be the mysterious bride Caleb's been expecting." "I'm Mara Whitlow." She shook his hand briefly, noting the way his grip lingered just a moment too long. "I'm here to help manage the house." "Manage the house?" Luke's smile widened. "That's what they're calling it now? Well, good for Caleb. Man needs someone to warm this place up. It's been a tomb since he built it." There was nothing overtly improper in his words, but something in his tone made Mara uncomfortable. She withdrew her hand and stepped back. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Carter?" "Luke, please. We're all neighbors out here. No need for formalities." He leaned against the porch rail, settling in like he had all day. "I just came by to borrow Caleb's post-hole digger. Mine broke yesterday, and I've got 50 feet of fence that needs setting before the cattle decide the grass is greener on his side." "I'm not sure where he keeps his tools," Mara said, "but you're welcome to look in the barn." "Appreciate it." Luke made no move toward the barn. "So, Mara Whitlow, you come all the way from, where was it, Nebraska?" "Yes." "Long way to travel for housekeeping work." Mara met his eyes directly. "It seemed like a good opportunity." "I'll bet it did." Luke's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his expression, a calculation, an assessment. "Caleb's a good man, quiet, keeps to himself, but solid as they come. You could do worse." "I'm sure that's true." Mara moved toward the door. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to finish." Of course, of course." Luke pushed off from the rail. "I'll just grab that digger and get out of your hair. But Miss Whitlow—" He paused, tipping his hat. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, my place is just over that ridge. I'm always happy to help a lady in need." Mara forced a smile. "That's very kind." She watched from the window as Luke found the post-hole digger in the barn and rode off, whistling tunelessly. When he was out of sight, she let herself breathe again. Caleb arrived an hour later, smelling of sweat and sage and honest work. He washed up at the pump outside, then came in to find Mara setting the table for lunch. "Carter stopped by," she said without preamble. "Borrowed your post-hole digger?" "Did he?" Caleb's voice went flat. "Say anything? Ask questions? Made assumptions?" Mara set down a plate with more force than necessary. "Called the house a tomb." Luke's got opinions on everything and the sense to keep most of them to himself. Caleb sat heavily. "But he's not wrong about the house. It has been empty." "Not anymore." The words came out more firmly than Mara intended. I'm going to make curtains for the windows. Organize the pantry properly. Get that garden planted before the first frost. This place has good bones. It just needs someone to care for it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. You planning to do all that in 3 months? I'm planning to make the most of whatever time I have. That almost smile touched his mouth again. Fair enough. But pace yourself. Wyoming will wear you down if you try to do everything at once. They ate together, and Mara found herself telling him about her morning, the books she'd found, her plans for the house, the 100 small details that would transform bare function into actual home. Caleb listened with the quiet attention of someone unused to being talked to, occasionally asking questions that showed he was paying closer attention than his stillness suggested. When the meal was finished, he lingered at the table instead of rushing back to work. There's fabric in the trunk in the spare bedroom, he said abruptly. Calico, muslin, some other things. Bought it a while back, thinking. He broke off, shaking his head. Anyway, it's there if you want it, for your curtains or whatever else. Mara felt her throat tighten. You bought fabric? Seemed like something a house should have. Caleb stood, clearly uncomfortable with the turn the conversation had taken. I've got to check the cattle in the south pasture. I'll be back before supper. He was gone before she could respond, leaving Mara alone with the revelation that this hard, quiet man had bought fabric for a bride he'd never met, hoping to make a house into a home. She found the trunk that afternoon, tucked in the corner of one of the empty bedrooms. Inside, carefully folded, were bolts of fabric in colors that made her breath catch. Deep green like pine forests, soft blue like summer sky, cream-colored muslin fine enough for undergarments. There was lace, too, delicate and expensive, and thread in a rainbow of colors. Mara ran her fingers over the fabric and felt something crack open in her chest. This wasn't just practical, this was hope, purchased and stored away against a future Caleb had been brave enough to imagine, even if he'd been too afraid to reach for it directly. She carried the blue fabric downstairs and spread it on the table, measuring windows with a length of string, cutting carefully, her hands remembering skills her grandmother had taught her. By the time Caleb returned that evening, she had the beginnings of curtains pinned and ready for stitching. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Fabric spread across his table, Mara bent over her work with complete concentration, the house transformed by such a small thing as the promise of curtains. You work fast, he said. I told you. I'm used to being useful. Mara looked up, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Two people who'd learned to measure their worth in work, finding common ground in the language of labor. Supper will be ready in an hour, she said. I found a chicken in the coop that looked ready for the pot. You wrung its neck yourself? I've been wringing chicken necks since I was 10 years old, Mr. Rowan. It's not exactly delicate work. That earned her a real smile. Small, but genuine. No, I don't suppose it is. He moved toward the stairs. I'll wash up. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. Caleb worked the ranch with the methodical dedication of someone for whom work was both livelihood and religion. Mara worked the house with equal dedication, transforming it piece by piece from austere shelter into something approaching warmth. Curtains appeared on windows. The pantry became organized by type and season. The garden plot was cleared and planted with late-season vegetables that might mature before the first hard freeze. And slowly, in increments so small she almost didn't notice, they began to talk. It started with small things, observations about the weather over breakfast, questions about ranch operations while Mara kneaded bread, stories that slipped out during evening meals when the day's work was done, and the house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Caleb talked about his cattle with the same careful attention other men gave to their children, describing bloodlines and grazing patterns and the particular personality of his lead bull, a massive Hereford named General Grant, who had, Caleb claimed, more strategic sense than half the officers he'd served under during the war. Mara found herself talking, too, about her grandmother's hands, gnarled with arthritis but still capable of the finest needlework, about the year the locusts came to Nebraska and ate everything green down to bare earth, about the small rebellions of her childhood that no one had noticed because Lillian's larger dramas always took center stage. You're bitter about that, Caleb observed one evening. They sat in the parlor, Mara stitching curtains while Caleb oiled tack that had seen better days. About being overlooked. Wouldn't you be? Mara didn't look up from her stitching. 23 years of being second choice. Second thought, the one you turn to when the first option falls through. I was the youngest of 5 boys, Caleb said. By the time I came along, my father had run out of interest in raising sons. I was fed, clothed, educated, all the necessities provided. But noticed? No. I could have vanished into the woods, and it would have taken them a week to realize I was gone. Mara's hands stilled. I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me self-reliance. Caleb worked oil into the leather with steady, methodical strokes. Taught me that waiting for someone else to see your worth is a fool's game. Better to know your own value and stop expecting validation from people too blind or too busy to give it. Is that why you came west? To stop waiting? I came west because the war taught me I was good at staying alive when other men weren't, and that seemed like a poor qualification for civilian life. His hands never stopped moving, but his voice went distant. Couldn't stomach going back to Pennsylvania and pretending the last 4 years hadn't happened. Couldn't sit in church and sing hymns with men who'd sent boys to die and then came home to profit from it. So I came here, where nobody knew me and nobody cared what I'd done or seen or survived. Do you ever regret it, being alone out here? Caleb's hands paused, and he looked at her with those winter gray eyes. I did. Every day for the first 2 years, I regretted it. Then one morning, I woke up and realized I'd slept through the night without nightmares for the first time since Antietam. Realized I could hear birds instead of artillery. Realized the silence wasn't empty. It was clean. He went back to his work. After that, alone felt less like punishment and more like peace. Until it didn't anymore, Mara said softly. Until it didn't, he agreed. A man can only talk to cattle for so long before he starts to wonder if he's forgotten how to talk to people. He set aside the bridle and picked up another. What about you? You ever regret coming here? Mara considered the question seriously, her needle pulling thread through fabric in a rhythm as old as time. No, she said finally. I regret the lie that brought me here. I regret that your money went to pay my father's debts instead of bringing you what you actually wanted. But being here, working this house, making it into something, I don't regret that. Even though it's not permanent? 3 months is longer than I've ever had anything that was mine to shape. Mara tied off her thread and examined her work. Neat, even stitches that would hold for years. I'll take it. The conversation settled between them like dust, comfortable and unremarkable, and they worked in companionable silence until the fire burned low and Caleb announced he was turning in for the night. After he'd climbed the stairs, Mara sat alone in the parlor and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like if the 3 months stretched into something longer, something permanent. Then she folded her sewing, banked the fire, and went to bed before imagination could turn into hope. The next morning brought Luke Carter back to the ranch, this time on the flimsiest of pretenses, returning the post-hole digger he could have kept for weeks without Caleb noticing or caring. Mara answered the door to find him freshly shaved, his shirt suspiciously clean for a working rancher, his smile as bright and calculated as a carnival barker's. Miss Whitlow. He swept his hat off with theatrical courtesy. Don't you look lovely this morning? Mara was acutely aware that she wore her oldest work dress. Her hair was escaping its bun in 6 different directions, and she had flour on her left cheek from rolling out pie crust. Mr. Carter? Luke, please, I keep telling you. He glanced past her into the house, and his eyebrows rose. Well now, would you look at that? Curtains. And is that a pie I smell? Apple. Mara didn't step aside to let him in. Mr. Rowan is in the north pasture. I can tell him you stopped by. Oh, I'm in no hurry. Luke leaned against the doorframe, settling in. Besides, I came to return the digger and to extend an invitation. I'm having a few neighbors over Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just dinner and some music. I'd be honored if you and Caleb would join us. That's kind of you, but before you say no, let me point out that you've been here near 2 weeks and haven't met anyone except me. People are curious about you, Miss Whitlow. You might as well satisfy that curiosity on your own terms, rather than let the gossip mill run wild.
He had a point, much as Mara hated to admit it. In a place this isolated, news of Caleb's housekeeper would spread like prairie fire, and the stories would grow more lurid with each retelling. Better to face the curiosity head on than hide and let imagination fill the gaps. "I'll ask Mr. Rowan," she said, "but I can't promise anything." "Fair enough." Luke pushed off from the doorframe, his eyes traveling over her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You know, you're nothing like what I expected." "And what did you expect?" "Someone softer, prettier maybe. More—" He paused, searching for the word. "Delicate. The kind of woman who'd need a strong man to take care of her." Mara felt her spine straighten. "Then it's fortunate I'm not that kind of woman, isn't it?" Luke's smile widened. "Very fortunate indeed."
Caleb's a lucky man, getting someone with substance instead of just surface shine. It was meant as a compliment, Mara supposed, but it landed like an insult. The backhanded praise of a man who thought he was being generous by finding value in plainness. She was saved from having to respond by the sound of hoofbeats, and Caleb appeared around the corner of the barn astride a rangy bay gelding. His expression when he saw Luke was carefully neutral, but Mara had learned to read the small tells, the tightening around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Caleb didn't like Luke Carter any more than she did, but he was too polite or too practical to say so. "Carter?" Caleb swung down from his horse with easy grace. "Something I can help you with?" "Just returning the digger and inviting you and your lovely housekeeper to dinner Saturday." Luke's tone was friendly, but there was something challenging in it, a subtle claim being staked. "What do you say, Caleb? Time you introduce Miss Whitlow around to the neighbors." Caleb looked at Mara, and she gave a small shrug. The decision was his. After a moment, he nodded. "All right. What time?" 6 o'clock. I'll have Martha fix up something special." Luke mounted his horse, gathering the reins. "It'll be good to have some new conversation for a change. A man can only discuss cattle prices and weather for so long before his brain starts to rot." After he rode off, Caleb stood staring after him with an expression that suggested he was seriously considering letting his brain rot if it meant avoiding Luke Carter's dinner party. "You didn't have to say yes," Mara said. "He's right about one thing. You should meet the neighbors, and Luke throws a decent party, even if he does talk enough for 3 men. Caleb started toward the barn, leading his horse. "Just don't expect too much. These aren't Nebraska society people. They're ranchers and farmers, rough around the edges and suspicious of outsiders." "I think I can manage rough around the edges," Mara said dryly. "It's the smooth ones that worry me." That earned her a sharp look, and Caleb's mouth twitched. "Luke giving you trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle, but he's got the kind of charm that feels like a rope settling around your neck, friendly enough until it starts to tighten." "That's Luke in a nutshell." Caleb paused in the barn doorway. "You want me to tell him to back off?" The offer surprised her. "Can you do that without starting a feud?" "Probably not, but I'd do it anyway if you needed me to." Mara studied him, this quiet, contained man who'd taken her in on nothing but her word and a good meal, who was offering to defend her honor against a neighbor he had to live beside for years to come. Something warm unfurled in her chest, dangerous as spring fire. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but I'd rather fight my own battles when I can." "Fair enough. But if that changes, you'll be the first to know." Caleb nodded and disappeared into the barn, leaving Mara standing in the yard with her heart doing complicated things she didn't have names for. She went back inside and threw herself into her work, kneading bread dough with enough force to murder it, trying not to think about the way Caleb had looked at her when he offered to stand between her and Luke Carter's smooth-talking charm. The week passed in a blur of preparation. Mara had nothing suitable to wear to a dinner party. Her 2 work dresses were patched and faded, and her grandmother's Sunday dress was 30 years out of fashion and smelled of mothballs. She spent 2 evenings unpicking one of Lillian's cast-off dresses that had been shoved into the bottom of her trunk, remaking it to fit her taller, broader frame. The fabric was a soft gray-green that reminded her of sage, and when she finally finished the last hem, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. It wasn't beautiful, but it was respectable. Saturday evening arrived with a sky the color of bruised plums and a wind that smelled of coming rain. Mara dressed in her remade gown and pinned her hair into something approaching elegance, studying herself in the small mirror with critical eyes. She looked like what she was, a plain woman in a plain dress, trying her best. It would have to be enough. When she came downstairs, Caleb was waiting in the parlor, and the sight of him made her breath catch. He'd shaved, tamed his hair, and wore a shirt that was actually pressed, probably for the first time since he'd bought it. He looked uncomfortable and handsome in equal measure, and when he saw her, something flickered across his face too fast to name. "You look nice," he said gruffly. "So do you." They stood there for a moment, awkward as teenagers, until Caleb cleared his throat and gestured toward the door. "We should go. Luke considers anything less than punctual to be an insult." The ride to Luke Carter's ranch took 20 minutes, the wagon rattling over a track that was more suggestion than road. Caleb drove in silence, his jaw tight, and Mara wondered if he was regretting this as much as she was beginning to. Luke's house was larger than Caleb's, newer, built with an eye toward impressing visitors rather than simply providing shelter. Light spilled from windows dressed with expensive curtains, and Mara could hear piano music and laughter, the sounds of a party well underway. "How many people did he invite?" she murmured as Caleb helped her down from the wagon. "Knowing Luke? Everyone within 20 miles. Caleb offered his arm with stiff formality. "Stay close. Some of these folks are friendly, some are just nosy. It's not always easy to tell which is which." They climbed the steps to Luke's front porch, and the door opened before they could knock. Luke stood there in a brocade vest that must have cost a month's wages, his smile wide and welcoming. "Caleb, Miss Whitlow, right on time." He ushered them inside with theatrical gestures. Come in, come in. Everyone's dying to meet you." The house was full of people, at least 24, Mara estimated, all dressed in their Saturday best and watching the door with undisguised curiosity. Luke propelled them into the parlor like a showman introducing his star attractions. "Folks, this is Mara Whitlow, lately of Nebraska, and currently keeping house for our friend Caleb here." Luke's voice carried across the room. "Miss Whitlow, let me introduce you around." The next hour was a blur of names and faces. There was Tom Hendricks, who ran sheep on the South Ridge and had opinions about everything from cattle breeding to presidential politics. His wife Martha was the one who'd cooked the dinner, a small, fierce woman with flour permanently embedded under her fingernails and eyes that missed nothing. The Patterson family ran a dry goods store in Cheyenne and spent most of their time complaining about railroad prices. Young Billy Morrison was fresh from Montana, looking to buy land and apparently looking for a wife too, based on the way his eyes kept drifting to Mara's face. Through it all, Caleb stayed close, his hand occasionally touching her elbow in silent support. She was grateful for his presence, even if he said almost nothing, letting Luke and Tom Hendricks dominate the conversation with the easy confidence of men who'd never doubted their right to be heard. Dinner was served at a table that groaned under the weight of Martha Hendricks's cooking: roasted beef, potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh bread, 3 kinds of vegetables, and 2 pies for dessert. Mara found herself seated between Caleb and Tom Hendricks, with Luke directly across the table, positioned to command the conversation. "So, Miss Whitlow," Tom said around a mouthful of beef, "how are you finding Wyoming territory?" "Beautiful," Mara said honestly. "Harsh, but beautiful." Harsh is one word for it. Martha Hendricks leaned forward, her shrewd eyes studying Mara. "How'd you come to be keeping house for Caleb, if you don't mind my asking? It's a long way from Nebraska for domestic work." The table went quiet, everyone suddenly very interested in their plates, while their ears strained to catch her answer. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the inevitable question, the curiosity that couldn't be satisfied without some form of truth. Mara felt Caleb tense beside her, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Rowan had arranged for my sister to come west as his bride. When she changed her mind, I came in her place to honor the commitment." The silence that followed could have suffocated a strong man. Martha's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Tom Hendricks choked on his wine. Even Luke, for once, seemed at a loss for words. "Your sister changed her mind," Martha said slowly, "so you came instead. And you and Caleb, you're not married?" "No, ma'am." Mara met the woman's eyes directly. "Mr. Rowan has hired me to manage his household. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." "A business arrangement," Tom Hendricks found his voice. You're telling us you're living under Caleb's roof, unmarried, and it's just business? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Mara's spine straightened. Mr. Rowan needed help with his house. I needed employment. We made an arrangement that benefits us both. If that offends your sense of propriety, I'm sorry for it, but the arrangement stands. Caleb's hand found hers under the table, squeezing once. Support, gratitude, warning, all compressed into that single touch. Mara squeezed back and didn't let go. Martha Hendricks was the first to break the tension, her stern face splitting into a smile that transformed it entirely. Well, I'll be damned. Good for you, dear. About time someone brought some practical sense to Caleb's life. Man's been rattling around in that house like a dried pea in a pod for too long. Martha, Tom protested weakly. Oh, hush, Tom. Everyone here was thinking it. Martha raised her glass. To practical sense and honest work, may we all have enough of both. The toast was drunk with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and conversation resumed, though Mara could feel the weight of speculation settling over the room like fog. She'd satisfied their curiosity, but given them plenty to gossip about, an unmarried woman living with a bachelor, no matter how practical the arrangement. In a week, the story would be all over the county. In a month, it would have grown teeth. Across the table, Luke Carter watched her with an expression that made Mara's stomach tighten. It wasn't disapproval exactly, but something more calculating, like a man who just learned an interesting piece of information and was deciding how best to use it. After dinner, the furniture was pushed back and someone produced a fiddle. Dancing began, rowdy and enthusiastic, with more energy than grace. Mara stood near the wall, watching couples spin and stomp, when Billy Morrison appeared at her elbow. Miss Whitlow, would you do me the honor? He held out his hand, hopeful as a puppy. Before she could answer, Caleb materialized beside her. Miss Whitlow promised me the first dance, he said evenly, but I'm sure she'd be happy to dance with you after. Billy retreated, disappointed, and Caleb extended his hand with a formality that would have been funny if Mara's heart wasn't suddenly trying to climb out of her chest. I don't actually know how to dance, he said quietly, but it seemed like a good excuse to keep Morrison from stepping on your toes. I appreciate that. Mara took his hand anyway. Though I should warn you, I don't know how to dance either. Then we'll figure it out together. They moved into the chaos of dancers with no idea what they were doing, Caleb's hand firm on her waist, Mara's resting on his shoulder. They shuffled more than danced, moving in vague circles while around them couples spun with wild abandon. I meant what I said, Caleb said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. About it being a business arrangement. If people talk, if it causes you trouble, people will talk regardless. Mara looked up at him, struck by how close his face was to hers, by the flecks of darker gray in his eyes that she'd never noticed before. I knew that when I came here. I'm not ashamed of honest work. Neither am I. His hand tightened slightly on her waist. But I don't want you paying for my choices. Your choices got me off a failing farm in Nebraska and gave me work that matters. Mara found herself swaying closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. I'd say we're even. The fiddle music swirled around them, wild and sweet, and for a moment Mara forgot about the watching eyes, the speculation, the complicated tangle of truth and deception that had brought her here. There was only Caleb's hand warm on her waist, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he looked at her like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. The song ended too soon. Caleb stepped back, releasing her with what might have been reluctance, and Billy Morrison swooped in to claim his promised dance. Mara let herself be led back into the fray, but her attention kept drifting to where Caleb stood against the wall, watching her with those winter-gray eyes. The party wound down near midnight. Mara found herself cornered by Martha Hendricks near the punch bowl, the older woman's eyes sharp with curiosity and something that might have been approval. You handled yourself well tonight, Martha said. These gatherings can be brutal on newcomers. Everyone's looking for weaknesses, for reasons to exclude or condemn. And did they find any? Mara asked. Oh, they found plenty to gossip about, don't you worry. Martha smiled. But you didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't try to make yourself smaller to fit their expectations. That takes backbone. Or desperation. Sometimes those are the same thing. Martha glanced across the room to where Caleb stood talking with Tom Hendricks, his face carefully neutral. He's a good man, Caleb. Damaged, like most of the men who came back from that war, but good underneath the scars. He deserves someone who sees that. I'm just his housekeeper, Mara said carefully. Of course you are, dear. Martha patted her arm. And I'm just a simple rancher's wife. We're all just exactly what we say we are, and nothing more complicated than that. She started to walk away, then paused. But for what it's worth, I haven't seen Caleb look at anyone the way he looked at you during that dance. Not in all the years I've known him. She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Mara standing alone with her heart doing acrobatics in her chest. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The moon was high and bright, turning the landscape silver, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its loneliness to the stars. Caleb drove with his usual competence, but Mara could feel the tension in him, something coiled and waiting. Thank you, she said finally. For tonight, for the dance, for not letting them make me feel small. You're not small, Caleb's voice was rough. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, and I've met women who could birth babies in plow fields on the same day. The compliment hit her square in the chest, unexpected and devastating in its sincerity. I'm not strong. I'm just stubborn. Sometimes those are the same thing. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, but made no move to climb down. He sat with the reins loose in his hands, staring at the dark windows. When I sent that money to your sister, I had this idea, this picture in my head of what a wife should be. Pretty, soft-spoken, grateful for the opportunity. Someone who'd make the house feel less empty without demanding too much of me. I'm none of those things, Mara said quietly. No. Caleb turned to look at her, and his eyes were dark and serious in the moonlight. You're better. You're honest and capable, and you don't apologize for taking up space in the world. You make me remember that there are things worth talking about besides cattle and weather. You make the house feel like... He broke off, shaking his head. Never mind. I'm talking nonsense. No, you're not. Mara's hand found his on the seat between them, her fingers curling around his palm. You make me feel useful for the right reasons. Not because I'm solving someone else's problems or cleaning up someone else's messes, but because the work I do matters, because you see it and value it and don't take it for granted. She paused, gathering courage. You make me feel like I'm worth more than being second choice. Caleb's hand turned over, lacing his fingers through hers. You were never second choice, Mara. Your sister didn't choose to leave. She ran away from something real because it scared her. But you? You ran toward it. That makes you first choice in any book that matters. They sat there in the moonlight, hands clasped, while something wordless and powerful stretched between them, like a bridge being built board by careful board. Then Caleb cleared his throat and released her hand, climbing down from the wagon with an abruptness that suggested he'd scared himself with his own honesty. It's late, he said. We should get inside. Mara let him help her down, and they moved through the familiar ritual of settling the horses, banking the fire, checking that doors were latched against the night. When they reached the stairs, they paused, and for a moment Mara thought Caleb might say something more. Instead, he touched her shoulder briefly, just a brush of his fingers, there and gone, and climbed the stairs to his room. Mara stood alone in the parlor and pressed her hand to where he'd touched her, feeling the ghost of warmth through the fabric of her dress. 3 months, they'd agreed. 3 months to see if this arrangement could work. But standing there in Caleb Rowan's house, with the taste of possibility sharp on her tongue, Mara realized that 3 months might not be nearly enough time to figure out what she wanted. Or it might be exactly long enough to break her heart. She climbed the stairs slowly, her mind refusing to settle, and when she reached her room, she didn't bother lighting the lamp. Instead, she stood at the window and looked out at the valley bathed in moonlight, at the creek running silver through the cottonwoods, at the vast Wyoming sky that seemed to hold more stars than darkness. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear Caleb moving in his room, the creak of floorboards, the soft thud of boots being set aside. The sounds were intimate in a way that made her chest ache, reminders that they lived in the same house, breathed the same air, shared the same roof, but remained separated by walls both literal and carefully constructed. Mara undressed and climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the way Caleb had looked at her during that dance, the way his hand had felt warm and solid in hers during the wagon ride home, the way he'd called her first choice when she'd spent her whole life being anything but. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, still tangled in dreams, she thought it was just the cook stove being lit for breakfast. Then she heard shouting, Caleb's voice, urgent and sharp, and she bolted upright, heart pounding. Mara threw on her dressing gown and ran into the hall. Caleb's door stood open, his room empty, and when she reached the stairs, she could see orange light flickering through the windows. Fire. The barn was on fire. She flew down the stairs and out into the yard, her bare feet finding stones and sticks she didn't feel. Caleb was already at the barn, throwing buckets of water onto flames that licked up the south wall with hungry eagerness. The horses screamed inside, terrified, and Mara could hear the cattle bellowing in panic from the corrals. "Get the horses out," Caleb shouted when he saw her. "Get them to the north pasture and close the gate." Mara didn't hesitate. She ran into the barn through smoke that seared her lungs, found the first stall, and dragged the bay gelding out by sheer force of will. The horse fought her, eyes rolling white with fear, but she hung onto the halter and hauled him into the yard, slapping his rump to send him galloping toward open ground. Back into the barn. The smoke was thicker now, heat pressing down like a physical weight. She found the second horse, a mare heavy with foal, and got her moving, then the third, a young colt who nearly trampled her in his panic to escape. "That's all of them." Caleb appeared beside her, his face black with soot. "Get back to the house." "The cattle? I'll get the cattle." He pushed her toward the house with a hand that shook. "Mara, please, get clear." But she didn't go to the house. She ran to the well, grabbed a bucket, and joined him in the desperate, futile work of fighting fire with water drawn one bucket at a time. They worked side by side in grim silence, throwing water onto flames that seemed to laugh at their efforts, until finally Caleb grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "It's no use." His voice was hoarse with smoke. "The barn's lost. We need to focus on keeping it from spreading to the house." They spent the next 2 hours creating a fire break, soaking the ground between the barn and the house, wetting down the porch and walls while the barn burned itself out in a spectacular display of destruction. By the time the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the barn was nothing but a blackened skeleton, smoke rising from the ruins like the ghost of what it had been. Caleb stood staring at the wreckage with a face like carved stone. His hands hung at his sides, blackened and blistered, and Mara could see a burn on his forearm where an ember had caught him. He didn't seem to notice or care. "Caleb," she touched his shoulder gently. "Come inside. Let me look at your hands. I need to check the stock, make sure none of them got hurt in the panic. After I tend to your burns." Mara's voice left no room for argument. "You're no good to the animals if infection sets in." He let her lead him inside like a man walking in his sleep. Mara sat him at the kitchen table and fetched water, clean rags, the tin of salve she'd found in the pantry weeks ago. She cleaned his hands with gentle efficiency, noting the blisters that had already formed, the raw patches where skin had burned away. "This is going to hurt," she warned, and applied the salve with careful fingers. Caleb hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. "You should have stayed in the house. Could have gotten yourself killed running into a burning barn." "So could you." Mara wrapped his hands in clean bandages, tying them off with neat knots. "But you did it anyway because those horses needed you. Same reason I did it. It's my stock, my responsibility. And I live here too." Mara moved to his forearm, cleaning away soot to reveal an angry red burn the size of a silver dollar. "That makes it my responsibility too, whether you like it or not." Caleb was quiet while she worked, watching her face with an intensity that made her hands want to shake. When she finished bandaging the burn, he caught her wrist, gently, mindful of his own injuries. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the horses, for this, for not running back to Nebraska the first time things got hard." Things were already hard in Nebraska. Mara didn't pull away. At least here, the hardship means something. They sat there in the dawn light, connected by his hand on her wrist, until Caleb cleared his throat and released her. "I should check the stock, see what the damage is. I'll make breakfast. You'll need your strength." He nodded and stood, moving toward the door with visible effort. At the threshold, he paused. Mara, when this 3 months is up, when it's time to decide, I want you to know you'll have a choice, a real choice, not one forced on you by debt or duty or family obligation. Whatever you decide, it'll be because you want it. He left before she could respond, leaving Mara alone in the kitchen with her heart in her throat and tears she couldn't quite explain burning behind her eyes. She threw herself into cooking with the fierce concentration of someone using work to avoid thinking. By the time Caleb returned an hour later, she had eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits on the table, coffee strong enough to strip paint, and her emotions locked down tight. "Stock's fine," he reported, sitting heavily. "Spooked but unharmed. And I found what started the fire." "What?" "Lantern." Caleb's voice went hard. Someone hung a lit lantern on a nail in the hayloft. It burned through the rope and fell into dry hay. Mara's hand stilled over the coffee pot. "Someone? You mean it wasn't an accident? I mean, I don't keep lit lanterns in my barn, and I sure as hell don't hang them on rope that can burn through." Caleb accepted the coffee she poured, wrapping his bandaged hands around the cup with care. "Someone came onto my property and set that fire deliberately." "Who would do that?" "I don't know. Could be someone with a grudge. Could be someone who doesn't like me bringing in an unmarried woman to keep house. Could be random vandalism from drifters passing through." He drank his coffee in one long swallow despite the heat. "Doesn't much matter. The barn's gone either way." "You'll rebuild." Mara sat across from him, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "You've got insurance, don't you?" Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Insurance doesn't cover arson, and even if it did, I can't prove it wasn't an accident. No, I'll rebuild the old-fashioned way, with my own hands and what's left in my bank account after a summer of cattle prices dropping." "How bad is it?" Mara asked quietly. "Financially, I mean." "Bad enough that I'll be eating beans and jerky for the winter. Not so bad that I'll lose the ranch." Caleb met her eyes. "But bad enough that I can't pay you what I promised. Not until spring anyway, when I can sell off some stock." "I don't care about the money." "You should. You earned it." He pushed back from the table, his movements sharp with frustration. "I brought you here under false pretenses. Well, you came under false pretenses, but I let you stay with promises I might not be able to keep. You deserve better than working for room and board." "I've been working for room and board my whole life," Mara said. "At least here, I get thanked for it occasionally." But that got a real smile from him, small but genuine. "You do good work. I should say that more often." "You show it. That's better than saying it." They ate in silence, both of them too exhausted for conversation. When the meal was finished, Caleb stood and looked out at the smoking ruins of his barn with eyes that had seen too much loss already. "I need to start clearing the debris. Salvage what I can before weather gets to it." He flexed his bandaged hands experimentally, wincing. "Going to be a long day." "Then you'll need help." Mara stood and began clearing dishes. "Give me 20 minutes to clean up and change, and I'll be out to help." "Mara, don't argue. You need help. I'm offering. That's the end of it." She left him standing in the kitchen and went upstairs to change into her oldest work dress, the one she'd been meaning to cut up for rags. When she came back down, Caleb was waiting by the door with 2 pairs of heavy gloves. "Your hands are smaller than mine, Shekt," he said, handing her a pair that still swallowed her fingers. "These will be too big, but they'll keep you from getting blisters." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, sorting through the wreckage of the barn with methodical care. The fire had been hot enough to warp metal and turn good timber into charcoal, but some things had survived: tools, harness fittings, a few hand implements that could be cleaned and reused. They built a pile of salvage and another of debris to be hauled away, working side by side with the easy coordination of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Luke Carter arrived mid-afternoon, riding up with 2 of his hands in tow. He took in the destruction with wide eyes and a low whistle. "Hell, Caleb, I saw the smoke from my place but figured you were clearing brush." He dismounted and walked to the ruins, shaking his head. "This is bad. Real bad. What happened?" "Fire started in the hayloft," Caleb said shortly. "Lost the building, but saved the stock." "Thank Christ for that." Luke turned to his men. "Boys, let's give Caleb a hand with this mess." 4 hands work faster than 2. The offer was generous, and Caleb accepted it with visible reluctance. Mara watched Luke's men set to work with efficient competence, while Luke himself positioned himself near her, close enough to talk without being overheard. "Must have been terrifying," he said. "Waking up to find the barn on fire." It was. Mara didn't look at him, focusing instead on sorting through a pile of partially burned tack. "Lucky Caleb had you here to help. A man alone might have lost the whole place." Luke paused. "Of course, some folks might say a man alone wouldn't have had this kind of trouble in the first place." Mara's hands stilled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Nothing." Luke held up his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Just that people talk. And when an unmarried woman moves into a bachelor's house, tongues start wagging. Some of those tongues belong to people who take their morality seriously, seriously enough to make their disapproval known." "Are you suggesting someone burned down Caleb's barn because I'm living here?" "I'm not suggesting anything." Luke's smile was sympathetic, but his eyes were calculating. "I'm just saying that appearances matter in a place like this, and the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging as the real thing." Mara turned to face him fully. "Mr. Carter, if you have something to say it plainly." "All right." Luke stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Marry me." The words hit Mara like cold water. "What?" "Marry me," Luke repeated. "I'm offering you a way out of this mess. You'd have your own household, your own name, legitimate standing in the community. No more whispers, no more judgment." And Caleb, he glanced toward where Caleb worked with Luke's men. Caleb would be free to rebuild without the burden of protecting your reputation. "My reputation is my own concern." "Is it?" Luke's smile sharpened. "Because from where I'm standing, your reputation is currently costing Caleb his barn and quite possibly his livelihood. How long before it costs him more?" Mara felt sick. "You think I caused this?" "I think your presence here has complicated things in ways that might not be fixable." Luke reached out as if to touch her arm, then thought better of it. "I'm offering you a solution, a good one. I've got land, money, standing in the community. I could give you a comfortable life." "I don't want comfortable, and I don't want you." Mara's voice came out harder than she intended. "Thank you for the offer, but no." Luke's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "You might want to think about it before you refuse outright. Things have a way of getting worse before they get better. And Caleb's a proud man. He won't ask you to leave, even if staying destroys him." He walked away before Mara could respond, rejoining his men with that same easy smile, like the conversation had never happened. Mara stood alone in the wreckage, Luke's words echoing in her head like poison. What if he was right? What if her presence here had brought this down on Caleb? What if her stubborn insistence on staying was causing more harm than good? She was still standing there, frozen with doubt, when Caleb appeared at her elbow. "You all right? You look pale." "I'm fine." The lie tasted like ash. "Just tired." "We're about done here anyway. Luke's boys did good work. We cleared more in 2 hours than I would have managed in 2 days. Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Let's get you inside. You've been out in this sun too long." He guided her toward the house with a hand on her elbow, and Mara let him, too shaken to protest. Luke's words kept circling in her mind like vultures over carrion. What if her staying here really was destroying everything Caleb had built? That evening, Mara cooked supper with mechanical efficiency while her mind churned. Caleb ate without seeming to taste anything, his eyes distant, already calculating the cost of rebuilding and how long it would take. When the meal was finished, he retreated to the porch to smoke and stare at the ruins of his barn while darkness fell. Mara cleaned up in silence, then climbed the stairs to her room. But instead of preparing for bed, she lit the lamp and sat at the small desk beneath the window. She needed to think, needed to figure out what the right choice was when all the choices seemed wrong. She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard footsteps in the hall. Caleb's footsteps, coming toward her room instead of his own. He knocked softly. "Mara, you still awake?" "Yes." She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, still wearing his work clothes, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I need to show you something," he said, "if you're not too tired." Mara followed him down the hall to his room, a space she'd never entered, had carefully avoided even thinking about. He pushed open the door and gestured her inside, and Mara stepped across the threshold feeling like she was crossing some invisible boundary. Caleb's room was sparse, almost monastic. A narrow bed with military-tight corners, a washstand, a chest of drawers. But on top of the chest sat a wooden box, simple and unadorned, and it was to this that Caleb moved. "After the war ended, I spent 2 years drifting," he said, opening the box with careful hands. "Working ranches, sleeping rough, trying to figure out who I was now that I wasn't a soldier anymore. I wrote letters during that time, dozens of them. Never sent a single one." He pulled out a stack of papers, yellowed and creased, covered in that same careful handwriting Mara recognized from his advertisement letter. Some were to my parents, trying to explain why I couldn't come home. Some were to men I'd served with, asking questions I knew they couldn't answer. But most of them, he held up the stack, were to a woman I'd never met, a woman I was trying to imagine into existence. Mara's throat went tight. "Caleb, I need you to read them." He pressed the letters into her hands. "I need you to understand what I was looking for when I sent that money to Nebraska, and then I need you to decide if what you found here is worth staying for." He left before she could respond, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Mara stood alone in his room, holding the letters, feeling the weight of his loneliness pressed into paper and ink. She carried them back to her own room and sat on the bed, unfolding the first letter with shaking hands. The words were raw, unguarded in a way Caleb never was in person. He wrote about waking from nightmares with the taste of gunpowder in his mouth, about the sound of men screaming that followed him across years and miles, about the desperate, gnawing loneliness of building a life alone when everywhere he looked he saw ghosts. He wrote about buying fabric for curtains he had no one to make, about sitting at a table set for one, about the crushing weight of silence that pressed down on him every evening when the work was done. And he wrote about hope, tentative, almost embarrassed, that maybe a wife could help him remember how to be human instead of just surviving, that maybe sharing his space with someone else could make the ghosts fade, that maybe he could build something real instead of just existing in the ruins of who he used to be. Mara read through tears she didn't try to hide, understanding with painful clarity that Caleb Rowan hadn't been looking for a pretty bride to ornament his house. He'd been looking for a lifeline, thrown out blindly in the hope that someone, somewhere, might catch it and pull him back to shore. The last letter was dated 3 days before he'd sent the money to Nebraska. It was shorter than the others, just a single page. "I've decided to risk it. To send money to a woman whose picture looks kind, whose letters seem honest, whose words suggest she might understand what it means to be overlooked. Maybe she'll come, and maybe she won't. Maybe she'll be what I need, or maybe I'll disappoint her, and she'll leave. But at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have reached out instead of drowning in silence. If you're reading this, whoever you are, whenever you arrive, please know that I didn't send for you to fill an empty space. I sent for you because I'm tired of being alone with my ghosts, and I thought maybe, just maybe, you might be tired of being alone with yours. All I'm asking is a chance, a real chance, built on truth instead of pretense. I don't know if that's enough, but it's all I have to offer." Caleb Mara read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word, understanding finally what Caleb had been trying to tell her since the moment she'd stepped off that stagecoach. He hadn't wanted perfection. He'd wanted partnership. Someone brave enough to face the truth, strong enough to stay through hardship, honest enough to say when things were hard instead of pretending everything was fine. He'd wanted exactly what she'd been trying to be. She folded the letters carefully and set them on the nightstand, then stood and walked down the hall to Caleb's room. The door was closed, but light showed beneath it. She knocked softly. "Come in." Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, still dressed, his bandaged hands resting on his knees. He looked up when she entered, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache. "I read them," Mara said. "And?" She crossed the room and sat beside him on the bed, close enough that their shoulders touched. And I think you sent for the wrong sister, but you got the right woman anyway. Caleb's breath hitched. Mara, I know about the fire, about what Luke said. She turned to face him. He thinks my being here caused this. He offered to marry me, to give me a way out that would protect your reputation and your livelihood. The muscle in Caleb's jaw jumped. What did you say? I told him no. Mara reached for his hand, carefully mindful of the bandages. Because I don't want comfortable, and I don't want easy. I want this. She gestured at the room, the house, the life they'd been building in careful increments. Even if it's hard, even if it means people judge us, even if someone burned your barn because they don't approve of me being here, if that's why the barn burned, then they're small-minded fools, and I refuse to let small-minded fools dictate how I live my life. Mara's voice went fierce. I spent 23 years making myself smaller to fit other people's expectations. I'm done with that. If you'll have me, if you still want me here after knowing what my presence might cost you, then I'm staying, not for 3 months, for as long as you'll let me. Caleb stared at her with those winter-gray eyes, and slowly, carefully, he brought his bandaged hand up to cup her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone with impossible gentleness. I want you here, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not because you're useful, not because you can cook and clean and work yourself to the bone. I want you here because when you're in a room, it doesn't feel empty anymore. Because you make me remember what it's like to care about something besides just surviving. Because you're brave and honest and you don't flinch from hard truths. He paused, his eyes searching hers. I want you here because somewhere between Nebraska and Wyoming, between deception and truth, between what I paid for and what I got, I started falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and fierce. Mara felt tears spill over, tracking hot down her cheeks, and she didn't try to stop them. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't mean to. I tried not to. But you make me feel like I matter, not for what I can do, but for who I am. And I've never had that before. Caleb pulled her close, and Mara went into his arms like coming home, pressing her face against his chest and feeling his heart pound against her cheek. They stayed that way for a long moment, holding each other in the lamplight, two people who'd been alone too long finally finding what they'd been searching for. When Caleb finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Marry me. Not because of arrangements or money or obligation. Marry me because we choose each other every day, no matter what comes. Yes. Mara didn't hesitate. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. But Mara kissed him back with all the fierce certainty of someone who'd finally found where she belonged, and the kiss deepened, becoming a promise sealed in touch and breath and wordless understanding. When they finally broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his bandaged hands cradling her face. We'll rebuild the barn together, face whatever comes together, build a real life together. Together, Mara agreed. No more ghosts, no more loneliness. Just us, facing forward. They sat together on the edge of his bed, hands clasped, while outside the window the Wyoming night stretched vast and star-filled and full of possibility. The barn was gone, the future uncertain, but in that moment, none of it mattered. They had each other. And that was more than enough. They married 3 days later in Martha Hendricks's parlor with Tom as witness and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Cheyenne. Mara wore her remade sage green dress and wildflowers in her hair that Caleb had picked that morning, his bandaged hands clumsy but determined. The ceremony was brief, the vows simple, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that made Martha dab at her eyes with her apron. About time, Martha said afterward, pulling Mara into a fierce embrace. I knew the moment I saw you two together at Luke's party. Took you long enough to figure it out yourselves. Tom shook Caleb's hand with genuine warmth. You got yourself a good woman, Caleb. Don't mess it up. I'll do my best not to. Caleb's arms settled around Mara's waist, solid and sure, and she leaned into him, feeling something she'd never felt before. Chosen, claimed, wanted for exactly who she was. They drove home as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The blackened skeleton of the barn stood stark against the sky, a reminder of what they'd lost and what still needed rebuilding. But Mara looked at it and felt no despair, only determination. "We'll start on the barn next week," Caleb said, following her gaze. "I've got enough timber on the north ridge to frame it out. It won't be as big as the old one, but it'll serve." "We'll make it work." Mara laced her fingers through his. "We'll make all of it work." That night, Mara moved her belongings from the spare room to Caleb's room, their room now, and they lay together in the narrow bed, learning each other in the darkness. Caleb traced the curve of her shoulder with gentle fingers, his touch reverent, and Mara pressed her palm against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her hand. "I never thought I'd have this," Caleb murmured into her hair. "Someone to hold. Someone who chose to stay. I never thought anyone would want me to stay." Mara tilted her face up to kiss him. "We're both learning something new." They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time since the war, Caleb slept through the night without nightmares. The next morning brought Luke Carter riding up the path with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mara was hanging laundry when she saw him approach, and something in her stomach tightened. She called for Caleb, who emerged from the tool shed with a hammer in his hand and a wary expression on his face. "Luke?" Caleb's voice was neutral. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." "Heard you got married." Luke dismounted, his gaze sliding between them with sharp assessment. "Figured I'd come by and offer my congratulations." "That's kind of you." Mara stepped closer to Caleb, a united front. "We appreciate it." "Do you?" Luke's smile sharpened. "Because I have to say, Caleb, I'm a little surprised. 3 days ago your barn burned down, and now you've tied yourself to the woman who brought that trouble to your door. Seems like poor timing." "Mara didn't bring trouble." Caleb's voice went hard. "And I'd appreciate it if you kept your opinions about my wife to yourself." "Your wife?" Luke said it like he was tasting something bitter. "Well, I suppose that makes it all respectable now, doesn't it? Never mind that she came here under false pretenses. Never mind that she's not what you paid for. Luke!" Caleb took a step forward, and there was something dangerous in the movement. "You need to leave now." "Or what? You'll take a swing at me with those burned hands?" Luke's mask of friendliness dropped entirely. "Let me tell you something, Caleb. That barn didn't burn by accident, and it won't be the last thing you lose if you insist on keeping that woman here." The words fell like stones into still water. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. You burned the barn." "I didn't say that." Luke's smile returned, cold and calculated. "I'm just saying that people around here have standards. They don't take kindly to unmarried women living in sin with bachelor ranchers, and they especially don't take kindly to women who lie their way into men's homes. Some folks might decide to make their displeasure known. Get off my property." Caleb's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "And if you or anyone else comes near my wife, my stock, or my land with intent to harm, I'll put a bullet in you and sleep soundly afterward. That's not a threat, Luke. That's a promise." Luke's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Caleb. This woman isn't worth what she's going to cost you." "That's where you're wrong." Caleb moved to stand beside Mara, his hand finding hers. "She's worth everything. And if you can't see that, then you're a bigger fool than I took you for." Luke mounted his horse with jerky movements, his face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this, both of you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving dust and threats hanging in the air behind him. Mara turned to Caleb, her hands shaking. "He burned your barn. He admitted it." "As good as." Caleb's jaw was tight. "But we can't prove it, and even if we could, his family's got money and influence. The sheriff wouldn't do anything. So he just gets away with it? For now." Caleb pulled her into his arms, his chin resting on top of her head. "But Luke's got a short temper and a long memory. He'll make a mistake eventually, and when he does, I'll be ready." "What if he comes back? What if he tries to hurt you, or the stock, or—" Mara couldn't finish the sentence, fear closing her throat. "Then we deal with it together." Caleb pulled back to look at her, his eyes fierce. "I'm not letting him drive you away, Mara. I'm not letting anyone drive you away. You're my wife now, and that means something. It means I stand between you and whatever threatens you, same as you'd stand for me." "I would," Mara said fiercely. "I'd stand against anyone for you." "I know." Caleb kissed her forehead. "That's why we're going to be all right. Whatever Luke throws at us, we'll face it together." But Luke's threats cast a shadow over the following weeks. Caleb started sleeping with a rifle beside the bed and checking the property twice each evening before dark. Mara found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, watching the road for riders who might bring more destruction. They worked on the barn together during the day, Caleb's hands healing slowly as he hammered and sawed, Mara passing him tools and holding timber steady while he cut it to size. The work was hard, the progress slow, but there was something deeply satisfying about building something with their own hands. They worked mostly in silence, communicating through gesture and glance, falling into a rhythm that felt natural as breathing. By the end of the first week, they had the frame up. By the end of the second, the walls were taking shape. It was during the third week that Tom Hendricks rode up with news that made Caleb go still. "Luke's place burned last night," Tom said without preamble. "Not the house, thank the stars, but his main barn and half his hay stores. Luke's claiming you did it, Caleb. He's got the sheriff coming out to ask questions." Caleb's face went carefully blank. "I was here all night. Mara can attest to that." "I know, and Martha knows. And anyone with half a brain knows you wouldn't be stupid enough to burn a man's property in revenge." Tom shifted in his saddle. "But Luke's making noise, and Sheriff Morrison has to investigate, or people will say he's playing favorites." "Let him investigate." Caleb's voice was calm, but Mara could see the tension in his shoulders. "He won't find anything because there's nothing to find." Sheriff Morrison arrived that afternoon, a gray-haired man with tired eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd heard every story twice. He questioned Caleb and Mara separately, asked about their whereabouts the previous night, examined the partially rebuilt barn with careful attention. "Luke says you threatened him," Morrison said, his pencil scratching across paper. "Says you told him you'd burn him out if he caused you more trouble." "I told him I'd put a bullet in him if he came near my wife or property with intent to harm," Caleb corrected. "That's not a threat to burn his barn. That's a promise to defend what's mine." "And you were here all night?" "Every minute. Ask my wife." Morrison turned to Mara, who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Mrs. Rowan? Can you confirm your husband's whereabouts last night?" "He was with me from sundown until sunrise." Mara met the sheriff's eyes steadily. "We're newlyweds, Sheriff. We spent the night together." Morrison's weathered face colored slightly. "Right. Well," he closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "That's pretty clear then. I'll tell Luke you've got an alibi." "While you're at it," Caleb said quietly, "you might want to ask Luke about my barn, about a lantern hung on rope in the hayloft, about threats he made 3 days before he rode off my property." Morrison's eyes sharpened. "You saying Luke burned your barn?" "I'm saying someone did, and Luke admitted to knowing about it." Caleb crossed his arms. "But I've got no proof. Same as Luke has no proof I touched his property. So we're at a stalemate, aren't we?" The sheriff studied Caleb for a long moment, then sighed. "This is going to get ugly if you two don't find a way to settle it. Land feuds have a way of spreading, dragging in neighbors, turning into something nobody can control." "Then maybe you should tell Luke to leave me and mine alone." Caleb's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I didn't start this, Sheriff, but I'll finish it if I have to." After Morrison left, Mara found Caleb standing at the edge of the property, staring toward where Luke's ranch lay beyond the ridge. She came up beside him, slipping her hand into his. "Do you think he burned his own barn?" she asked quietly. "I don't know." Caleb's thumb traced circles on her palm. "But it would be just like Luke to destroy his own property if it meant he could pin it on me. He's that petty." "What do we do?" "We keep building, keep living, keep refusing to give him the satisfaction of running us off our own land." Caleb turned to face her, his expression fierce. "And we watch our backs, because Luke's the kind of man who holds grudges until they turn to poison." They worked on the barn with renewed urgency, racing against the onset of winter and the threat of whatever Luke might try next. Tom Hendricks and Martha came to help, bringing their sons in a determination to see Caleb's barn finished before the first snow. Even Billy Morrison showed up one Saturday, shy and earnest, offering a strong back and willing hands. "Heard you could use help," Billy said, ducking his head. "And I figure neighbors should help neighbors, no matter what some folks might say about it." Caleb shook the young man's hand with genuine gratitude. "Appreciate it, Billy. We can use all the help we can get." They worked together through that long afternoon, men and women side by side, and when the sun set on a barn that was 3/4 finished, Martha brought out food and they ate together in the yard, talking and laughing like old friends. Mara sat beside Caleb and looked around at these people who'd chosen to stand with them despite gossip and threats, and felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest. This was community. This was what it meant to belong. The barn was finished 2 days before the first snow, and they celebrated by moving the horses back into their new stalls and standing together in the center of the building, breathing in the smell of fresh-cut pine and looking up at rafters that would shelter stock through the brutal Wyoming winter. "We did it," Mara said, wonder in her voice. "We actually did it." "We did." Caleb pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "And whatever comes next, we'll handle that too." What came next arrived on a bitter November morning when Lillian stepped off the stagecoach in Cheyenne wearing a dress that cost more than most men made in a year and a smile that could have lit the whole territory. Mara was in town buying supplies when she saw her sister, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Lillian looked exactly as she always had, golden, perfect, untouchable. But there was something new in her eyes now, something calculating and cold that Mara had never seen before. "Mara!" Lillian swept toward her with arms outstretched. "Oh, how I've missed you." Mara accepted the embrace stiffly, aware of people watching, judging. "Lillian, what are you doing here?" "Why, I've come to see my dear sister, of course." Lillian pulled back, her eyes scanning Mara's face with sharp assessment. "And to meet the man you married. I hear he's quite the catch. 200 acres, cattle, all that rugged Western charm." Her smile turned brittle. "Funny how things work out, isn't it? I send him away, you take him for yourself. One might almost call it opportunistic." "One might call it surviving." Mara kept her voice low. "What do you really want, Lillian? Can a sister visit without ulterior motives?" But Lillian's eyes slid away, guilty and defiant at once. "Mother sent me. She's worried about you living out here alone with a stranger." "I'm not alone. I'm married. And Caleb's not a stranger anymore." "No, I suppose he isn't." Lillian's gaze sharpened. "I'd like to meet him. Surely you won't deny me that." Mara wanted to refuse, wanted to send her sister back to Nebraska on the next stagecoach, but refusing would only make Lillian more determined, and besides, some part of Mara wanted Lillian to see what she'd thrown away, wanted her perfect golden sister to understand that not everything worthwhile came wrapped in pretty packages. "Fine. But we're leaving town now and you'll stay at Martha Hendricks's place, not ours." "Worried I'll steal him away?" Lillian's laugh was bright and cruel. "Oh, Mara, you always did think so little of yourself." They drove back to the ranch in tense silence, Lillian exclaiming over the landscape with performative enthusiasm, while Mara gripped the wagon seat and tried to calm the churning in her stomach. When they pulled up to the house, Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and Mara watched her sister's face as she saw him for the first time. Lillian's expression shifted through surprise, appreciation, and something darker, a kind of hungry calculation that made Mara's skin crawl. "Mr. Rowan?" Lillian climbed down from the wagon with practiced grace, extending her hand. "I'm Lillian Whitlow, Mara's sister. I've heard so much about you." Caleb took her hand briefly, his face carefully neutral. "Mrs. Rowan mentioned you might visit." "Mrs. Rowan." Lillian's smile sharpened. How strange to hear Mara called that. I confess, when I first wrote to you, I never imagined it would be my plain older sister who'd end up wearing your ring. The insult was delivered with such sweetness that it took a moment to register. Mara felt her face heat, but before she could respond, Caleb's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. "Strange how things work out," he said, his voice mild but his eyes hard. "I wrote for a woman who could charm and deceive. I got one who's honest and strong instead. Can't say I'm disappointed with the trade." Lillian's smile faltered. "I meant no offense." "Didn't you?" Caleb's grip on Mara tightened.
Because where I come from, calling a woman plain to her face is about as offensive as it gets, especially when that woman is my wife. I was only teasing. Lillian looked between them, calculating her next move. Mara knows I don't mean anything by it. We've always had this kind of banter between us. Did you? Mara found her voice, found her spine. Because I remember you saying things that cut, Lillian. I remember you taking up all the air in every room while I made myself small enough to fit in the corners. That wasn't banter. That was cruelty dressed up as sisterly affection. Lillian's mask cracked, revealing genuine shock beneath. Mara. No. Mara stepped forward out of Caleb's protective embrace to face her sister directly. You came here to see what I'd made of your cast-offs, to judge whether I deserved the life you threw away. Well, here it is. Here's the man you were too afraid to meet, the ranch you were too scared to build, the future you ran from because it required actual courage, instead of just looking pretty and waiting for someone else to solve your problems. That's not fair, Lillian whispered. Isn't it? Mara's voice was steady, certain. You've spent your whole life being the beautiful one, the desired one, the one everyone wanted. And when you finally got what you claimed to want, a chance at adventure, at building something real, you panicked and sent me instead. Not because you cared about honoring your commitment, but because you wanted the money without the work. Tears welled in Lillian's perfect blue eyes. I was frightened. I didn't know what else to do. You could have been honest. Mara's anger drained away, leaving only weariness. You could have written to Caleb, explained that you'd changed your mind, given him the chance to find someone who actually wanted to be here. Instead, you took his money, spent it, and sent me in your place like I was some kind of consolable prize. I thought, Lillian's voice broke, I thought you'd be grateful. You had no prospects, no future. I gave you an opportunity. You gave me a lie to carry. Mara shook her head. But you know what? I'm grateful anyway. Because that lie brought me here, and once I was here, I had the courage to tell the truth. And that truth gave me something you'll never have. A man who chose me knowing exactly who I am, not who I pretended to be. Caleb moved to stand beside Mara, his presence solid and sure. Your sister's right, Miss Whitlow. You did me a favor by not coming, because if you had, I would have gotten exactly what I thought I wanted, someone pretty and charming to fill empty space. Instead, I got Mara, and she's worth 100 women who only know how to look good on a man's arm. Lillian stared at them, at their united front, and something in her face crumbled. I see. She turned toward the wagon, her movements stiff. I should go. This was clearly a mistake. Lillian, Mara's voice stopped her sister mid-step. You can stay for supper if you want. Meet our neighbors, see what we've built here. But you need to understand something. I'm not your second-choice sister anymore. I'm not the plain one, or the useful one, or the one you turn to when you need someone to clean up your messes. I'm Caleb's wife, and I'm happy. Lillian looked back at her, and for the first time in Mara's memory, her beautiful sister looked small. Are you? Happy? More than I've ever been in my life. Mara reached for Caleb's hand, lacing their fingers together. So if you came here to pity me, or to reclaim something you think you lost, you're wasting your time. But if you came because you actually care, if you want to know your sister instead of just using her, then you're welcome to stay. Lillian stood frozen for a long moment, her face working through emotions Mara couldn't name. Finally, she nodded. I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. They ate supper together that night, the three of them, and slowly, painfully, Lillian began to show cracks in her perfect facade. She talked about Nebraska, about their mother's declining health, and their father's increasing bitterness. She admitted, haltingly, that she'd come west partly out of curiosity, and partly because she'd been thrown over by the banker's son she'd set her sights on marrying. He said I was beautiful, but boring, Lillian said, staring at her plate. That I had nothing to offer except a pretty face. It hurt more than I expected. Because it was true? Mara asked gently. Because I'd never considered that beauty might not be enough. Lillian looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. You always had substance, Mara. You could cook and clean and make things grow. You could work hard and never complain. I thought that made you less valuable, but I'm starting to think I had it backward. Beauty and substance aren't mutually exclusive, Caleb said quietly, but substance lasts when beauty fades, and work that matters leaves something behind when you're gone. Lillian stayed for 3 days, and in that time, Mara watched her sister truly see her for perhaps the first time. Lillian helped in this kitchen, her hands clumsy with work they'd never done. She walked the property with Mara, marveling at the garden plot that would sleep through winter and wake in spring. She sat with them in the evenings while Caleb read aloud from his books and Mara stitched by lamplight, and slowly the brittle edge in her voice softened. On the morning she left, Lillian hugged Mara with genuine warmth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for using you, for taking you for granted, for thinking that being beautiful meant I didn't have to be anything else." "I forgive you." Mara pulled back to look at her sister. "But Lillian, you need to figure out who you are when no one's looking, because that's the person you'll have to live with when the mirrors stop being kind." Lillian nodded, tears streaming down her perfect face. "I'll try, I promise I'll try." After she left, Caleb pulled Mara into his arms and held her while she cried. For the sister she'd wanted, for the years of being second, for the relief of finally being seen. "You were magnificent," he murmured into her hair. "Brave and honest, and everything I knew you were." "I was terrified," Mara admitted. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway." Caleb kissed her forehead. "You've been brave since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and told me the truth." Winter came hard that year, burying the valley in snow that reached the windowsills and turned the world into an endless expanse of white. Mara and Caleb spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and learning each other in the deep quiet that only winter brings. They made plans for spring, more cattle, a larger garden, maybe even a trip to Cheyenne for supplies and socializing. And in late February, when Mara realized she was carrying Caleb's child, they made new plans entirely. "A baby," Caleb breathed, his hand splayed across her still flat stomach with something like wonder. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Mara asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy?" Caleb laughed, and the sound was young and unburdened. "Mara, I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. We're going to have a family, a real family, built on truth and choice and love." They told Martha first, who cried and hugged them both, and immediately began knitting tiny blankets. Tom clapped Caleb on the back with enough force to stagger him. Billy Morrison brought a hand-carved cradle he'd made himself, blushing furiously as he presented it. Even Luke Carter, when he heard the news in town, had the grace to offer grudging congratulations, though the look in his eyes suggested the feud wasn't forgotten, merely dormant. Spring came with a rush of green and the promise of new beginnings. Mara's belly grew round, and Caleb treated her like she was made of spun glass, which amused her to no end. "I'm pregnant, not broken," she told him when he insisted on carrying water for her. "Humor me," he said, kissing her cheek. "You're carrying our future. Let me take care of you while you do the hard work." The baby came in late August with Martha attending and Caleb pacing holes in the kitchen floor. After 12 hours of labor that left Mara exhausted and triumphant, she held their daughter in her arms, a tiny, perfect thing with Caleb's gray eyes and a surprisingly strong grip. "What should we name her?" Caleb asked, his voice thick with emotion. Mara looked down at the child they'd made, this living proof that second chances were real and love could grow from the most unlikely soil. "Hope," she said. "Let's call her Hope." And in that Wyoming ranch house, with the valley stretching green and gold beyond the windows, Caleb Rowan and Mara Whitlow. Rowan held their daughter and understood that they'd built something more valuable than land or cattle or even the love between them. They'd built a future where truth mattered more than beauty, where choice mattered more than obligation, where a woman who'd spent her whole life being overlooked could finally be seen and valued for exactly who she was. Years later, when people asked Mara how she came to Wyoming, she would smile and tell them the truth, all of it, the deception and the courage, the fear and the love, the substitute bride who became the first choice. And she never, not once, regretted the lie that brought her west.